Okay, so we're going to be looking at the American West paper now, and this is question 2, the narrative account question. So I think this is quite a difficult question. This is why I've done a clip about it. Is I've tried to narrow it down into 4 questions. I've looked across the whole topic, and here are the 4 questions here. Top tips for this answer are: make sure you plan out your answer. That's really important. Obviously, it's going to be quite difficult because, depending on the question, your knowledge might be quite limited. And if you're going to get a good mark, you must use more than the 2 stimulus. Also, try and use linking words between your paragraphs, so this led to, or as a result, or because of this. So that's the kind of thing they'll be looking for. So let me just talk through some of the questions. So this is the first question about why did people begin to move west. So the beginning of this story really is in 1825. They discovered the South Pass through the Rocky Mountains. Gradually, this led to the first pioneers travelling to Oregon in 1836. The biggest push factor away from the east was the financial crisis of 1837. People had no jobs, people lost their savings, farms were ruined, so many people began to think about starting a new life. This was accelerated and helped by the government, and in 1841 they mapped the routes and they published a guidebook, so people literally would just follow this step by step. Obviously this has kind of led into the manifest destiny idea that we were going to dominate and control this continent. 1846, the second wave was the Mormon wave, so they were told to leave Illinois after the death of Joseph Smith, and obviously moving into Utah. And then the third big pull factor is the discovery of gold. So it happened at various times, so 1848 in California, in the Rockies and the Black Hills. So all of this led to people moving west and covering over. So that's really the first question there. The second question, the development of the cattle industry. Well, this all kind of started in 1855. Texas, massive state, remember the size of Germany, huge place. They had quarantine laws. The cattle there, that longhorn cattle, carried little ticks called which caused Texas fever. So other states like Missouri passed quarantine laws that blocked Texas cattle from being driven north. The big factor here was the Civil War. So I made a mistake there. I'll change that. So Texans fought in the Wat, not in a Thai temple, but in the war. So they fought in the war, and as we politely put, the herds ran wild. And so they bred up, and we had millions of cattle in Texas. So the value of that cattle was about between $3 and $5. The demand in the northern cities, so a lot of immigration, particularly from southern Europe. So there was a huge demand, traditional cuisine, obviously lasagna, stuff like that, led to huge demand. So the price of beef in the north was about $50. So you get $5 in Texas, $50 in the north. So it was a huge incentive to move that cattle north. This was accelerated even further in 1867, the railroad reached Abilene. Joseph McCoy, the entrepreneur, decided to set up a cow town, made it really easy for people to drive cattle up there, and then also to transport it on the trains east. This led to a huge bonanza, and cattle barons such as John E. Liff set up huge ranches. I think the last thing to mention here is obviously this was a huge money-making thing, but by 1886 it was effectively the end of the open range. There was a bad winter in that year, lots of cattle died, and also primarily homesteaders fencing off land using barbed wire made the drive very, very difficult. So inevitably it led to them going into places like Montana and establishing huge ranches. So quite a complex and wide question there. Number 3, this is the impact of government policy on Indians. So the starting point of this was the Fort Laramie Treaty in 1851. So effectively this was the recognition that began the reservation process. Also the Indian Appropriation Act also bought up lots of the land in the east. So this gradually became a process of Indians having smaller and smaller plots of hunting ground. And in 1862 it led to Little Crow's War. So they were on a reservation and really running out of food, and basically Little Crow and his men decided to attack the store, and they stole the food. This led to a huge response by the US Army, who attacked them, and basically they killed several US soldiers, but a few months later they'd surrendered or been captured. The Sand Creek Massacre, again, the Cheyenne were starving. They began to attack wagon trains and store food. After a number of years of attacking, they eventually negotiated and set down in a camp. This is when the Colonel, Chivington, attacked. Lots of Indians were massacred in cold blood. So lots of people were horrified by that. 1866, 1868, this is Red Cloud's War. So they built a number of forts to protect their gold in Montana. This broke the Fort Laramie Treaty, so the Indians began to attack the miners, but they couldn't actually attack the forts because they didn't have the heavy weapons to do that. And in the end, the US Army negotiated the Second Fort Laramie Treaty, which agreed they'd abandon these forts, and the Red Cloud agreed to go on the reservation. Okay, the last question is about, very similar to that, but just getting clear in your head, this is the later section, so the impact of government policy from 1876 to 1890. So this obviously started the Battle of Little Bighorn. So this is lots and lots of Indians who were fed up of being on a reservation, basically decided to all gather together in a huge gathering, about 7,000. The US Army identified them and attacked from 3 directions. The attack was a total disaster and a complete failure for Custer, who was killed, and lots of his men were killed. Now, the significance of that was the American government became determined to destroy the Indians, or certainly change public opinion. So in the short term, a disaster for the American government. In the long term, it helped them take over the Indian land. Also, during this process, obviously the government was encouraging people to hunt buffalo and exterminate buffalo, and without the buffalo, the Indians would starve. Also, the process of reservations, moving Indians onto reservations where they became reliant on corrupt Indian agents. Eventually, they passed the Dawes Act in 1887, which was like the equivalent of the Homestead Act, which effectively gave and made Indians, gave them 160 acres of land. Indians were not used to farming. Effectively, it freed up land for whites as well. And the last bit of this was by 1890, the Wounded Knee Massacre. The ghost dance was spreading around the reservation, the idea that the Indians, the buffalo would return, the Indians would reclaim their land. This kind of made the US Army nervous, and they opened fire, and this was really the last clash between the Sioux and the US Army.